And I want any senior leader that's listening to the podcast to really consider picking up the book for yourself, certainly know what it is that you're recommending, but maybe consider buying a few copies for early career professionals that you're mentoring. Maybe it's that person on your team that you just haven't been able to spend a lot of time with, whoever it is in your orbit. Give them the book as a gift, encourage them to read it. But I have another step for you, and it's probably the most important step. I want to challenge you to make an investment of time in going through the book with that early career professional. So give them the book, but say, listen, maybe once a month, I want you to get on my calendar for a cup of coffee. And I just want to talk about what you're learning in the book. I also want to share, a little bit about my background, some of my failures and successes. And I want to learn from you as well.
This is the Leadership Foundry podcast. I'm your co-host this week, Brandon Smith, and joining me this week is my co-host and co-founder of the Leadership Foundry, Randy Hain. Randy, good to see you, my friend.
Always good to see you as well.
I'm really excited about our conversation today because, drum roll, Randy has a brand new book he just recently published, Practical Virtue, an actionable guide to help you become a leader worth following. Randy, as always, I am thrilled every time you put out a new book. It always adds so much more color and context and, frankly, clarity to how we can show up as better leaders. Now, this book's a little bit different than some of your more recent books. Share a little bit more about what makes this book different.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we're talking about this. It's a much needed book that came out of a lot of thought and reflection last year. You and I talk all the time about developing early career professionals. How do we invest in Gen Z? How do we help them? I'm on college campuses a lot, talking to college seniors. I mentor a cohort of young leaders. And it's just, I've known for years, and I think you would agree, that this is a very underserved group. I don't think they're being developed enough. I don't think they're being grown enough. So last October-ish, I took a look at previous work I've done. And you and I have talked about this, but I've written about various virtues, which are also great leadership skills, probably about 35 times over the last 20 years. So what I did over the holidays is I pulled together my favorite virtues, which again are essential leadership skills. I wrote some new virtues, some new chapters, and I pulled it together for this generation of early career professionals. So what you're holding up, the Practical Virtue book, is written specifically for, I think, 21 to early 30s. And it's really meant to give them essential leadership skills and really help them accelerate their growth professionally and personally to become those leaders that we would all want to follow. So that's really the purpose of the book. And we can talk later about this, but I also think there's a great role for senior leaders to play in this as well.
It's just fantastic. And so this book, what I love about the books you write and your style is it allows the reader to read the whole book, or they can just enter into points in the book that are particularly relevant for what they're working on. And you really double down on that this time because you've got it alphabetized. Mm-hmm. So essentially, if folks say they want to work on kindness, they go to right after the chapter on joy and right before the section on learning, they've got kindness. So they can kind of hone in right there. Mm-hmm. So I love that. It's very practical, as always, and very easily accessible, which I think is beautiful, my friend.
Thank you.
So in typical fashion, I'm going to make things a little challenging for us.
All right, let's do it.
So you've got this alphabetized in the table of contents. Mm-hmm. If we were to shuffle all that up and reorder it, and you had to pick one of those virtues, one of those topics to mm-hmm. start on first, what do you think is the starting place for early career professionals?
That's easy. That's not even a challenging question.
Oh, well. I'm curious.
It's the virtue of credibility. I think by far that is the one that I would want to spend time talking to early career professionals about, how to be professionally credible.
Okay, so again, we're not going to spoil the book. There's so much richness in here, but if we just honed in on that one a little bit more.
Sure.
Why is that so critical for early career professionals?
Mhm.
And when you talk about kind of professional credibility, what are some of the areas that this particular group needs to focus on?
The thing about credibility is you never really know if you're not showing up as credible. It's not something that people often say, "Hey, I enjoyed meeting today. I want to let you know that you weren't very credible." It's just not something that's shared, you know? So when you think about, those seniors, college seniors looking for internships or their first job, let's say they do poorly in the interview. Let's say that maybe they don't do a follow-up thank you note, or they're less than professionally dressed. Maybe they don't follow up in their communication in a timely and appropriate manner. These are all things that ding their credibility. So I think it's really important and essential to have a chapter devoted to the virtue of credibility. So the entire chapter goes through best practices that will enhance your credibility, but also it tells you how to get accountability partners and people who can help you to help you grow in that area. But I think credibility is essential. Now, you might argue, and you might want to go down this path, that it's not something that's exclusive just for Gen Z and millennials. All of us need to think about credibility, and you can gain it or lose it on a daily basis. But I think for this emerging generation, I really want to give them something that they can grab a hold of that helps them show up immediately as credible. So I think it's a very important chapter.
So when we think about that early career stage professional right now, that would be Gen Z, and we got Gen Alpha kind of coming up behind them.
Right.
Our millennial friends are getting, many into their 40s at this point.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about that generation, is there anything that you would hone in on that's unique about Gen Z that maybe is different from millennials or Gen X or Boomer, that is particularly unique to some of the context and culture in which they grew up in, that they would need to focus on in here?
That's a great question. And I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. Now, to mind you, this is anecdotal, but I do have Gen Z children. I do spend time with a lot of Gen Z young professionals and students. So I've got a pretty big sample size to go from. And I research this a lot. But these are the things that come to mind, Brandon. I think in the interview process, for instance, let's say you're looking for a new job. I think something that Gen Z especially should really be mindful of is the need to be appropriately respectful and appropriate when it comes to language and titles. In your first interview, I would go with Mrs. Smith versus Sally. I would go with Mr. Johnson versus Bill. Until you get, through that first door, maybe they give you permission. I would be a little bit more formal in how you interact with people. We can always get informal later, but it's not a good idea to start with informal. I think something that I know is near and dear to your heart, Brandon, is communication and follow-up. If you hear from a client or if you hear from a potential employer on Monday and you take 3 days to respond, that is demonstrating very clearly that you're not that interested. It's not that big of a deal to you, and you show up as less than credible. So I think timely follow-up, appropriate professional communication, and then from there we could get into appropriate dress. It's probably always a good idea to maybe over-index towards a coat and tie or something that's a little bit more formal until you learn if this company is more business casual, then you can change. But I would say, showing up as an older, more mature, credible version of what you might feel is okay is probably what this chapter can teach you. So those are 2 or 3 of the things that come to mind. I don't know if you have a similar list in mind, but those are the ones that I think about.
No, I think that's fantastic. So what's evergreen and timeless that you would say any 23-year-old would need to think about this as they're developing their career, developing themselves into a leader, whether it was in 1995, 2005, 2015, today? What would you say are a couple of the timeless ones?
I think I have 2 that are probably neck and neck for me. One is a brand new chapter I wrote on accountability. Personal accountability, being accountable for your own actions. The virtue of accountability is timeless, evergreen. We always need to be thinking about, if I touch it, I own it. If I'm involved 1%, I need to act like I own 90%. So never feeling like It's okay to point the finger, push blame off to someone else, not be responsible. So I think this idea of accountability and responsibility is one of my favorites, and I wrote a whole new chapter about that. I think the other, and I hope this doesn't come across as old school, but I do think it's incredibly important, is the virtue of hard work. So I talk about it in the book, the virtue of hard work, through the lens of ownership, owning your career. So I go through my career and I look at the careers of others, and I think about the opportunity that I've been given so many times, and that opportunity was typically, we're going to hire you, we're going to give you an opportunity, but you have to work your way up into a bigger job. You've got to work hard to make as much money as you'd like to make. So I've always gone into new roles throughout my career, knowing that if I worked really hard and out hustled everybody around me, I would be given the opportunity that I was promised. And for me personally, that has always proven to be true. So in that particular chapter, The Virtue of Hard Work, I preach the merits of really having a great work ethic, applying yourself, being the one that is going to do the extra things. That's the best way to get noticed, is that person that will do whatever it takes to be successful. So personal accountability and hard work are my evergreen virtues.
Yeah. So, I'm curious too, as we're looking at some of the opportunities for the early stage professionals to grow. I love your concept of ownership. I think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, in the world we live in today, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, on another word that begins with O, optics.
Yes.
So in the old school days, the way you would impress and prove yourself is, if everyone came into the office at 9, you might show up at 8:30. You get in the office early, be the first one in, last one to leave. That was kind of an old adage that would often be preached. That doesn't sound like that's as consistently true today, either because of generational adoption of that concept, or the fact that we're not going into the office. What's your view on the optics of some of this stuff?
See, I love that question, because I think you're touching on everything that we've already talked about. And I think you're also touching on self-awareness, because if you're not concerned about optics, you're probably not very self-aware. So my message to anyone listening to this, if you're early career, older leader, whatever, is you've got to be kind of self-aware. How am I showing up? How do people react to me? How do other people perceive me? I wonder what my brand and reputation is in the company, on my team. So I think if you're an early career professional, if you have questions about how you're showing up and how people perceive you, the optics of your brand, I think it's incumbent upon you to go and ask. And really be seriously looking for an answer. Now, Brandon, listen, I've been on the team for 2 months. Would you mind giving me some feedback on how I show up? I really don't know. If you had 2 or 3 things that I could do differently, Brandon, on how I, show up in my personal brand, do you have any coaching for me? So I think optics matter. And the old adage, first, you only have one chance to make a first impression. If it's you're about to take a new job, you're about to take a new internship, you're up for a promotion, you should really be thoughtful about that first conversation with the hiring manager, that first interview, the dress, the follow-up. Did I send a thank you note, handwritten, which is one of my personal loves? But what are the optics of how I'm presenting to you? And I think that's not something that we're teaching. I don't think it's something that we're coaching. And I think this book, what we just talked about, is layered throughout the book. So even though I don't call it out necessarily as the optics, everything in this book is going to help you show up with better optics.
So I want to build a little bit on your answer there, Randy, because
Sure.
what I love about this book is it's got a couple ways it can be practically used.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the ways is what we've been talking about. A young professional can read this, and we say young professional could be someone in their 20s, even 30s. I mean, gosh, there's so much in this, it's timeless. Gosh, I've enjoyed reading it, and some of your greatest hits are in here, but with some slightly different colors and spins to it. So very valuable for really any professional. But one way is to just go in here, identify the items in the table of contents, and then maybe even hone in on 1 or 2 that you want to focus on, or read the whole book. That's one. But the second way that you've offered this as a possible tool
Mhm.
is to work alongside maybe a more senior leader, a mentor, and use this book as kind of a guide. Share a little bit more about how this could be used in a mentorship conversation.
I love this question because there is, in my mind, when I wrote the book, there was always a couple of different ways that the book would be valuable. So, absolutely, I want any early career professional that's listening to this to pick up the book and read it. You will be well served. It's an actionable guide. Please buy it, read it, and go through it. But I think there is another, almost more valuable way that the book could be used. Our audience is typically more senior leaders, Brandon. And I want any senior leader that's listening to the podcast to really consider picking up the book for yourself, certainly know what it is that you're recommending, but maybe consider buying a few copies for early career professionals that you're mentoring. Maybe it's that person on your team that you just haven't been able to spend a lot of time with, whoever it is in your orbit. Give them the book as a gift. Encourage them to read it. But I have another step for you, and it's probably the most important step. I want to challenge you to make an investment of time in going through the book with that early career professional. So give them the book, but say, listen, maybe once a month, I want you to get on my calendar for a cup of coffee. And I just want to talk about what you're learning in the book. I also want to share, a little bit about my background, some of my failures and successes. And I want to learn from you as well, because that's part of this. This is not just us teaching early career professionals. There is so much that we need to learn from them as well. So I think the two key uses of the book, early career professionals, buy it, use it, Godspeed. But I think more senior leaders buying the book and using it as an actionable guidebook and investing in conversations over the course of maybe a year or more, I think that's where the book becomes an invaluable tool, and I hope people will use it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to not only build those relationships, but so accessible, Randy. I mean, I'm thinking of myself as if I had somebody I was mentoring in this, if they asked me what kind of feedback could I give them, it's a great way to just go in here and circle a couple chapters and say, for our organization, or for the role you're in, or for you personally, or any of those three things, these are the three things I really want you to focus on.
Yeah.
I think that's so helpful, because a leader might have a particular point of view based on what they're trying to achieve in the organization, and they can kind of guide them this way. I think that's great. So let's stay on the book a little longer. If we drill down a little bit in here, and let's say we've got someone who's they're further along, they're still earlier in their career, but they are now a manager. Okay. And they're managing people. If you're still early in your career and you've just been kind of anointed manager for the first time, are there particular chapters in here that you think are relevant for a new manager, for example?
Yeah. I think, as you said earlier, there's a lot of richness in the book. And I think everything is relevant for early career. Everything is relevant for maybe that next stage. But if I had to pick a few, I probably would hone in on the chapters on the virtue of candor. I would probably hone in on the virtue of clarity. I think you're probably, as a new manager, really having to figure out how to be more patient with your colleagues. I think the chapter on the virtue of vulnerability, on how do I build trust with my team by showing more vulnerability. Those are some chapters that come to mind. Again, I want the 23-year-old to read it, but if you're getting into those first leadership roles, those are the ones that jump out at me as, as a leader, I need to get really good at these things. So that's my quick take on, what would be kind of that next level, grouping. That's where I'd go.
Okay. So Randy, there's a few more questions I've got for us today.
Sure.
If you were to identify a chapter in here that you see is the most common derailer for people early in their career, is there a derailer in here that you would say, yeah, this one, if it's completely ignored, this is where I see folks kind of damaging their brand early on and have to do recovery?
Again, you're throwing me softballs today, and I'm grateful. You probably thought that was going to be a hard question.
I think that was going to be.
I will tell you, and this is something that you and I have in common. We're both executive coaches. We're working with senior leaders every day in their teams. But one of the things that I would tell you is the virtue of relationship building. That's the one. Building relationships. If you're 22, 32, 42, 52, 62, doesn't matter. You've got to be focused on building trusting relationships at every stage of your career. I'm working with a number of leaders right now where their inability, maybe even failure to build some of those key relationships has gotten them in trouble. Think about if you're an early career professional, you're trying to learn the lay of the land, you're trying to cultivate mentors, whatever it is. You have to start by building relationships. So that, to me, that is the thread that runs through every generation, and it's probably the most robust chapter in the book, the longest, because I give you so many best practices and ways to think about how do you identify the right people, how do you network, how do you build relationships. It's all there, but to me, that's the one that is the thread that runs through everything. And I'm curious, do you agree with that? Is that your take?
Well, I think the relationship piece is so critical. I think that's exactly right. Because ultimately, it's those relationships that are going to open new doors for you. You're going to get sponsors out of that. You're going to create opportunities out of that. So I think that's tremendously valuable. I think it would be helpful, and I'd love to hear you add a little more color to that, because I think when folks just hear building relationships, they say, oh, I should go to networking events, or I should go to happy hours and talk to people. I don't think that's exactly what you're saying, but that's, I think, where a lot of people go, is they say, oh, I should mingle more. Say a little bit more about what does it mean to strategically build professional relationships.
You and I do a session together that I lead on relationships. And I always talk about the three biggest obstacles to building relationships. But if you do these things well, you will build an effective relationship that will serve you well. So I'm going to answer your question with these obstacles. If you can show up as authentic, if you can be your authentic self, people know that I'm really talking to Brandon right now. He's a real guy. I can connect to him. I relate to him. If you show up with curiosity, I'm really interested in you. I'd like to learn more about you. Tell me more about that. And listen actively to what you're hearing. And then finally, talking about trust, which actually involves authenticity, vulnerability, and you think about credibility. So these are all things that are so important. And you created the trust formula, which is a big part of that. So I think when leaders or aspiring leaders or early career professionals are thinking about relationships, I want them to be thinking about substantive relationships, great relationships that I've got someone I can rely on. I've got someone that will give me excellent, candid feedback. I've got someone that I know when I'm not in the room, they're advocating for me. When I think about relationships, that's where I go. And listen, I'm a high functioning introvert. So the whole idea of building surface networking relationships is alien to me anyway, because I can't stand doing that. I'm going to meet you and get to know you one cup of coffee at a time. And maybe that's going to be something that a lot of our listeners are going to be, clicking with. This is not just an extroverted action. Building relationships is for anybody, introvert, extrovert, anything in between. I may take the point of view, though, that you want to think about doing it from a more substantive perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And because as you're talking, it makes me think of those rare unicorns. You and I have met them before, where those people, and they're further along in their careers, may even be towards the end of their careers, and they say to us this statement: I've never actually been on an interview in my life. And what they're saying there is because they did great work, but they also built great relationships. And those relationships, as those people moved up, they brought them along.
Yes.
They've got a mentor or a sponsor or someone who's 10 years their senior, and that person gets promoted, and they of course bring them along. And then pretty soon, 20 years later, they're in a pretty senior role, having never actually had to go through the process of interviewing, because those relationships opened those doors, and their performance allowed them to walk through those doors. Yes. So I think what you're advocating is have that kind of life. It's a great life, and it's a lot easier and a lot less stressful than the alternative.
But you know what's interesting about everything that we're talking about, Brandon? These are all topics we love. We live in them. We teach them all the time. We write about them. But we come full circle back to the early career professional. You and I are more senior. We've got experiences. We've been doing this for decades. But think about the value of a 21 to 32-year-old diving into these topics, immersing themselves, becoming well versed, being able to navigate the minefields of their companies and their teams, equipped with this kind of insight. You and I take it for granted at our levels and ages. Oh, yeah, this is fun stuff. But if you're a young person, a young professional, you've not been exposed to this. So that's really why I wrote the book, is to give them this insight, this perspective, this knowledge that you and I take for granted. People only hire us to coach vice president to C-level executives, and we're grateful for it and we love the work. But wouldn't it be great if we could expose some 20-somethings to some of the things that we work with our senior leaders on? I think it's something that's much needed, and I'm really hopeful that this book will serve that purpose.
Yeah. Okay, Randy, I'm racking my brain for a hard question. I thought I was giving you some tough ones, and you've just been like knocking them out of the park. So I got, all right.
Because I love the topic.
Okay. All right. So speaking of hard, then let's go the other side of the coin.
Okay.
Of all your chapters in here, of all your traits and virtues, what's the hardest one? What would be the hardest one for an early career professional to take on and do really, really well?
It's the very first chapter, acceptance, the virtue of acceptance. Because what I'm advocating from a very personal, very, very difficult story in my life is accepting difficulty, accepting setback, and learning from it. I think that's the most difficult for any of us. But for an early career professional, learning how to deal with failure, learning how to deal with adversity, building resilience, building that grit. So that very first chapter of the book, out of the gate, I give you a glimpse into something that's very meaningful and personal for me and my wife that changed our lives because we practice the virtue of acceptance. That's the one that I think will be the most difficult. So I coming into the book, you're going to get a doozy right out of the gate, but it's a very important one.
Yeah, that's a life challenge
Yes.
for accepting a lot of things.
Yes.
So I think that's well said. And I thought I was going to give you a hard question, and that didn't seem like it was hard for you at all. Well, listen, partner, as always,
Thank you.
another masterpiece.
Thank you.
And I just think it's incredible that you've honed this one in on this particular audience to really help them. And I love that you've also written it in a way that is not only accessible, but it can be a bridge to relationships. They can use it, and it can be used to bridge with other more seasoned leaders. So they're not only developing their own skills and traits as a leader, they're developing those critical relationships. So, we love on this show to always end with kind of one closing thought. Is there one closing thought that you can think of for anyone listening to this today, whether they're a more seasoned senior leader or someone a little more junior in their career, something they can take away from this conversation or this masterpiece of yours, Practical Virtue, that can help them not only start developing as a leader today, but help their teams start thriving tomorrow? Any big takeaways?
As you sit in your seat today, if you're a listener, as you sit in your office, your car, wherever you are and you're listening to this, I would ask you respectfully to look in the, sort of the proverbial mirror and just ask yourself, am I being mentored? Am I mentoring others? Am I investing in my own growth? Am I investing in the growth of other people around me? And if you're not sure about the answer, or maybe the answer is no, this is a great book, I think, for you to start that journey. So if you are maybe a more seasoned leader, as Brandon said, a lot of my greatest hits are in there. I think you'll find a lot of value. But I challenge you to not stop there. I want you to immediately give the book to someone else and go invest in them. So let this become the book that you give around your circle. Buy extra copies and give to people around you. I will tell you that there is There's really no profit motive in this book because I'm pledging to give 1,000 copies of this book away to early career professionals. I have a number of talks this year where I plan to give the book away. So I really, truly want people to read it. So I challenge you to think about, am I being mentored? Am I growing? Am I mentoring others? And one thing I would say to end this, Brandon, I say this in the introduction, that I stand on the shoulders of giants. I have learned so much over the years from amazing people who write about virtue. And in the end of the book, I have an additional resources page where I encourage you to go deeper. I'm only a bridge to a deeper learning journey. So I want you to go to that page and maybe look up the other resources that I've cited that have had a big influence on me. So that's how I answer your great question.
It's great. Well, as always, partner, excellent work. And I would challenge everyone here who's listening today to not only buy a copy of the book available on Amazon, and obviously writing a review for Randy allows other folks to get access to the book and it has it pop up on their searches a lot quicker, but also take on that challenge of mentoring others with this book. And how can you take this book and use it as a bridge to bring along others around you? So, as always, our goal of any of our shows is for you to come away with a leadership nugget or two, something you can put in your toolkit that can allow you to not only develop yourself as a leader, but help you and your teams thrive starting tomorrow.